All right, so I want to welcome everybody back to African Black American Studies. This is the second session. And if you missed the first lesson, make sure you go back and check it out. And if you miss any lessons, you want to kind of watch them in order. And I do want to thank everybody who showed me so much love for the first session. And I appreciate everybody for enjoying it. And hopefully the rest of the sessions will be just as entertaining and just as educational as the first one. So last week, we started to see the beginning of European colonization and the transatlantic slave trade. And we saw how things like the doctrine of discovery laid the groundwork. And we saw black resistance even from day one, all the way back when the Portuguese first started showing up in the 1430s and 1440s. There has been resistance, like the Wolof Rebellion in 1521, or the first enslaved Africans to be brought into a Spanish colony in North America in 1526. We saw how they continued to fight back. And we also saw some of the first race-based laws introduced into the New World, quote unquote. Now, as we move forward, and if you have a question, feel free to ask. And like I said, there will be a time where anybody can ask their questions. But as we move forward, let's look at how some of the African leaders and the African people responded to this growing slave trade. Now, by 1575, the Portuguese already had a fort by Luanda, and they wanted full control of the area around Angola, which at the time was the Congo Kingdom and the Ndongo Kingdom. Now, originally, we saw the tribes in this area put aside their tribal differences to unite and fight back against the invaders. And by this time, they were starting to see how ruthless and savage, these Portuguese and other Europeans were. But at the time, it was mostly the Portuguese. And when they waged war, they burnt down villages, kidnapped thousands of people, took hostages. One source said they took up to 50,000 people. But you know what? These tribes put aside their differences, and they were able to defeat the Portuguese, even though they had a bigger army and more weapons. In the Battle of Lucala in 1590, they were able to push the Portuguese back and force their governor to flee. Now, after their governor ran back home, they tried to send somebody else, but by that time, the Portuguese had lost so many people from diseases and other things, and the Portuguese were no match for these united African tribes. And of course, that second governor was forced to flee and run back home. Now, the problem is a lot of damage had already been done. There were a lot of people who got sick, and not just sick physically, but also mentally. Now, there were many Africans who did side with the Portuguese, and some of them sided with the Portuguese for their own personal interests, which we see now in hindsight, which is 2020, that it didn't really do that much good. Now, despite all of this, they were still able to push the Portuguese back, but of course, Europeans don't just stop that easily. Now, during this time between 1590, when they pushed them back, a new ruler took over the Ndongo Kingdom, which was Queen Nzinga's father. Now, I know a lot of us have heard of Queen Nzinga, but when her father died in 1617, his son, Ngola Mbandi, took over. Now, the Portuguese saw it as a weakness, and they started attacking them, which lasted from 1618 to about 1622. And they were forced to negotiate with the Portuguese. Now, one of the main negotiators was Queen Nzinga herself, who went in her brother's place. And, there are stories. The famous story is how when she met with him, they didn't have a place for her to sit. So she had one of her people kneel down so she can sit like she was sitting on a throne. Now, they supposedly reached an agreement. And unfortunately, one part of that agreement was to give up some of their prisoners of war. And in exchange, the Portuguese were going to stop attacking them. And, they would do trade and business. But see, we have hindsight. which is always 2020. And we know historically what has happened with Europeans and treaties. And the treaty with Queen Nzinga and the Ndogo people and people of Congo was the same. They continued to attack them. They continued to kidnap their citizens because the agreement was to only take these prisoners of war, quote unquote. Now, Queen Nzinga's brother was apparently a harsh ruler, or at least harsh to her, and she was forced to leave. But when she returned in 1624, she took over as the queen. Now, originally, after taking over, Queen Nzinga tried to strengthen the treaty they had with Portugal. But, of course, we already know that there's nothing she could have done. But she converted to Christianity, got baptized, and then adopted the name Anna. But it didn't take long for Queen Nzinga to catch on and realize their treaties don't mean anything. Within 2 years, the Portuguese forced her out of the kingdom, but of course she wouldn't give up that easily. But she chose to fight back in a different way. Queen Nzinga built an army by allowing escaped slaves into her kingdom, and she organized mercenaries who had been trained by the Portuguese. She even went out of her way to form allies with her rivals, even though there had been rivals before the Europeans showed up, but they understood it was a greater threat at hand. So they put aside their differences and united. She even went as far as marrying the chief of another tribe so that she can strengthen her army and get more soldiers. Now, she handpicked soldiers to infiltrate the Portuguese army and to get information and to attack them from within. And she also used the method of divide and conquer and used Europeans fighting with each other to her advantage. She knew that the Portuguese and the Dutch were at odds, so she aligned herself with the Dutch and basically created an anti-Portuguese coalition. And she used it to keep the Portuguese back for decades, and she was able to protect her kingdom. Now, when word got back to Portugal, they sent a huge army to attack her in 1644, the biggest army she had ever faced. But Queen Nzinga and her people still won. But during that battle, the Dutch was also forced to retreat. So Portugal sent an even bigger army. Now, facing the biggest army she would ever have to face, Queen Nzinga decided to fall back and change strategies. She began using guerrilla warfare tactics. They used their knowledge of the land to their advantage. And they were somewhat successful, but it just wasn't enough. Now, Queen Nzinga continued to fight back into her 60s, even leading troops into battle in her 60s. But ultimately, she realized she had to turn her nation into a superpower to protect them. And by the time that she died, Europeans had to recognize her nation and her power. Now, going from a real queen, a real warrior like Queen Nzinga, to somebody else with the title of queen. In 1603, another Queen Elizabeth, and we just saw y'all Queen Elizabeth just died, and you know how much it affected y'all, how sad y'all were. But in 1603, Queen Elizabeth I of England died. Now, that's when y'all boy, King James himself, took over. And as black people, we know what he did in 1611, and we know that probably more than anybody. But within a year of y'all King James taking over, he reached a treaty with the Spanish, which gave England access to the doctrine of discovery and quote-unquote the New World. Now, we know they say their first permanent colony was the Jamestown colony in 1607. But what they won't tell you, and I mentioned it last time, how many of their colonies didn't make it. And even with this Jamestown colony, they barely made it, and they resorted to cannibalism during this quote-unquote starving time.
Scientists have found the strongest evidence yet that the colonists living in Jamestown, Virginia may have resorted to cannibalism. Times were tough in Jamestown in 1609 and 1610. If you can imagine, winter was coming, and supplies from England that were supposed to bring food and other materials never made it there. And relations with the local Powhatan Indians had gotten so bad that the few hundred settlers were actually hunkered down under a siege-like situation in the fort. People have written that things got so bad that the settlers may have resorted to cannibalism. Researchers digging through a pile of debris in Jamestown found bones that really took them by surprise. There was 2/3 of a skull and part of a leg bone that belonged to what they believe was a 14-year-old girl. And the reason the skull surprised them was that it had some very unique marks on them. But how do you even know that cannibalism happened when you're looking at bones that are several hundred years old? Well, it helps if you're a forensic anthropologist, like Douglas Owsley, who works at the Smithsonian Institution and was involved in interpreting the bones. What he saw was a skull that looked like nothing he had seen before. It had multiple knife marks and several large gashes to the front and back of the head that he believes were caused by either a cleaver or a lightweight hatchet. He also says there were signs that a sharp instrument was used to puncture part of the skull and pry it open. He told me that he believes that the 14-year-old girl was already dead when this occurred because he also works with victims of modern-day crime. And he says that if she had been alive when this happened, that there would be a different pattern of marks on the bone.
So they resorted to cannibalism, eating the dead, boiling lead so they can have something to drink. And they were just about to give up on the Jamestown colony when these good old natives, just like the Moors did, took it upon themselves to save them and pull them out of the starving times, just like they pulled them out of the dark ages. And once they showed them how to fish, how to cultivate the land and grow food and grow tobacco, it was a wrap. Now, even though they call us savages to justify their actions, although we just saw what they resorted to and what they called the starving time, that cannibalism likely extended to the slaves. And there were Africans as early as the 1450s who were saying, well, these Christians, aka these white people, were evil people and they were eating the flesh of the people they were kidnapping. Now, I personally believe their paranoia or their suspicion was justified, and there's a lot of evidence that shows this cannibalistic history, and I can point you into a few books, but we'll do that in another course. But the point is, there were some black people who saw what was going on and they knew what was up. But then you had a lot of black people, like we do today, who embraced these Europeans who were coming in. And most of the time, they usually traded animals and, other goods. And in exchange, they would get iron, copper, and unfortunately, tobacco and alcohol. Now, we can't skip past the black people who did trade other black people. And in most cases, for weapons, guns, to defend themselves. And we even saw something like that in the beginning with Queen Nzinga. Now, I know a lot of people just like to throw it out there, Africans sold other Africans, without actually examining the whole story and how many black people actually fought back. That's why it took them so long to get to the interior of Africa, because they faced so much resistance. And one of the main tools that Europeans used was deception. And they also heavily relied on divide and conquer. But the ones who chose to side with the Europeans were often betrayed, and Europeans would take more than what was agreed upon or take their actual citizens. And by 1610, the Portuguese had transformed the Dahomey Kingdom into a slave trading state.
I wish at this point to particularly to apologize deeply on behalf of the chiefs and people of Gold Coast and Ghana for the atrocities, the cruelty, the inhuman treatment that were committed 400 years ago by my ancestors during the Atlantic slave trade, where over 400 years ago, millions of our brothers and sisters were captured, sold, and transported under inhumane and cruel circumstances. through Elmina Castle across to the Caribbeans and to the New World. On behalf of the chiefs and people of Ghana, I do render unqualified apology, deep from the bottom of our hearts. Deep from our bottom of our hearts. But one thing that I want you to be aware of, it was not without resistance. Some of our chiefs did fought and resisted. Some of our people did fought and resisted. But we are fighting a losing battle against a stronger army. People with guns, and we had no guns. They deceived us with liquor and all other temptations. Whatever the circumstances that led us to us, we stand here to render apology.
And not long ago, we just saw all of these discussions on that movie, The Woman King. And that movie was based on the Dahomey tribe. And even though we saw Queen Nzinga use European infighting very effectively, Europeans were also able to use tribal wars to get Africans fighting each other. And at the time, with superior weapons, they were able to attack and destroy villages, rape so many people, kidnap so many people. And they told them that if you wanted us to stop attacking you, then you go out there and attack another tribe and bring us more slaves. But even when they agreed to that, Europeans still took their family members. When they sent people to trade the prisoners of war, they were taken too. And of course, the alcohol that was introduced didn't make it any better. And at that point, Africans still didn't realize the level of lies and deceptions they were dealing with. I mean, I still don't think we know today, but this was the first time they were actually seeing it. But they didn't realize, even if they sold somebody who looked like them, even if they were from another tribe, all of these black slave traders were just one day away from getting kidnapped themselves. And they often were. In one case, a black slave trader named Daga was tricked into getting on one of the boats. And they took him to either Cuba or Trinidad. And some people say when he got there, he ended up leading a rebellion. One African chief who had been trading black people for guns and things to protect his kingdom, but he realized they were taking his family during the exchanges. So even if he surrendered and attacked another black nation, it didn't matter. They still took his family. Now, some black leaders and kings or rulers who had been trading with Europeans started to hear about the treatment that these black people were receiving and started to realize nobody was coming back home. And look, we got to be real here. When we looking at history, we just don't see the same violence and inhumane treatment in African cultures that we do in European cultures. And I'm sure a lot of people didn't think they were treating them the way that they were. But that's definitely no excuse. Because one thing we still got to understand to this day, even though sometimes we see ourselves as different, they never saw them as different tribes. They looked at them as selling each other, selling themselves. And today we still have a hard time getting this concept of race. Even at a time they may have been unaware of that concept of this whiteness that we see today. If you sell your neighbors out for somebody who lives far away, usually it's going to lead to bad things. And even today, we'll make excuses like, well, it's the European technology, and compare that to African countries. Well, the people that they were taking out of these countries were the young people, the young men, young women. They weren't taking old, retired people. We're taking people with skill. So if you take all of the young people out of somewhere and all of the people with skill out of the same place and force them to work for you, of course there's going to be a big difference. But they got people who they know could work and left these places destroyed. So when African leaders started to see that black people weren't coming back and they started to hear about the treatment they were receiving, some of them started to speak out. Now we saw Queen Nzinga fight up until her 60s and do everything she could to protect her kingdom. Another great warrior queen, Madame Tinubu, who did trade with the Europeans early on, but once she realized what was going on, she did everything she could to fight them.
But within Africa itself, that was a great event that has been forgotten. Concurrent with the slave trade, and almost at the same time it began. Now, if you study the Nigerian woman, Madame Tinubu, who was in the trade for local consumption, and when she discovered that the people that she was capturing and using for local consumption were being taken out of Africa, not returned, she began a war on the trade. And fought the trade to a standstill, and fought all the kings in the business, including the king of then, Abukudu. And this is well recorded. And part of the story that there was a man asking for her hand because her husband had been killed, asking for her hand in marriage. And she told him that she had a man's work to do and she was not a woman until she finished it. And her job, she considered to be, is to pull from the throne every king in the slave trade. And when the last one was no longer king, she turned to the man that had been asking for her hand in marriage and said, okay, I will marry you now. I'm a woman. Now I'm a woman. I finished the man's work, so now I'm a woman. Married and went to a place called Jos in Nigeria.
Another one was King Alfonso I of Congo. When he found out what happened, he wrote letters to Portugal expressing his concern. And even though Alfonso became a Christian and allowed Catholicism into his nation and adopted the name Alfonso, he was still betrayed and they kidnapped more and more of his people. And as soon as he wrote a letter expressing his concern, he became a target.
So they began supplying guns to different villagers to start civil wars. At this time, King Alfonso I wrote to King John asking him to stop the slave trade because some kings realized this is getting bad. This is pretty bad here.
Upon this reality, King Vambo writes a letter to the King of Portugal saying, and I quote, "Each day the traders are kidnapping our people, children of this country, sons of our nobles and vassals, even people of our own family. This corruption and depravity are so widespread that our land is entirely depopulated. We need in this kingdom only priests and school teachers and no merchandise, unless it is wine and flour for mass. It is our wish that this kingdom not be a place for the trade or transport of slaves."
There is in our kingdom a great obstacle to God. Many of our subjects crave the Portuguese merchandise which your people bring to our kingdom so keenly. In order to satisfy their crazy appetite, they snatch our free subjects. They even take our noblemen and sons of noblemen, even our kinsmen. They sell them to white men who are in our kingdom, after having transported their prisoners on the sly in the dead of night. Then they are branded. The white men allege that they have bought them, but they cannot say from whom.
And the more and more African alliances deteriorated, the more and more powerful and more control Europeans got. Now, back in Jamestown, Virginia, in North America, the first 20 and odd Negroes, as reported by John Rolfe, landed in 1619. Now, I'm sure a lot of us have heard this 1619 date and stuff like the 1619 Project, but we already saw both free and enslaved Africans, free and enslaved black people already in America, North America. Now, I am saying that most people use this 1619 date because the British colony in Virginia expanded into what we now know as the United States of America today. But it's a common misnomer that this first 20 and odd Negroes came to Virginia as slaves. When they arrived, they were technically indentured servants. And yes, is a difference, just go ask the Irish. And also, Europeans somewhat still abided by the doctrine of discovery. And with the British, if you became a Christian, accepted the ways of the Englishmen, there was a small chance that you can get freedom and even in some cases get land. And most of these first 20 and odd Negroes were already Christianized and given Christian names or English names. Now, of these first 20 and odd Negroes was Antony and Isabella, what they call Negro. And after they gave birth to a son, William Tucker, in 1624, they officially became the first black family on record in the colonies, which became America. But this also gave birth to the war on the black family. Now, it's important that we look at this little 20 to 30 year period, because even though we already know that people recognize race, at least in this colony, black and white people were treated relatively equal. And I think that there's a lot of things from this 20 to 30 year period that still affects us to this day. Like thinking accepting the ways of the Englishmen will somehow save us, or converting to some other beliefs will somehow save us. And I think a lot of this period has some kind of influence on that. And even though in this little window they were treated relatively equal, by 1639, we started to see the first gun laws, when Virginia passed a law banning Negroes and only Negroes from arming themselves, essentially the first gun law in America. But by 1640, this so-called relatively equal treatment was already coming to an end. Now, in 1640, 3 servants, a Scotsman named James, a Dutchman named Victor, and an African named John Punch, all decided to run away together from this wealthy planter, a white dude named Hugh Gwynn. Now, they made it out of Virginia, but all 3 of them were captured and sent back to Virginia. They all received lashes and had to pay for any dues that was lost during the time they were gone. Now, this is where we start to see everything start to change, at least in this American colony. Now, these 2 white dudes were sentenced to 4 extra years of servitude on top of what they already had to serve. But this black man, this brother John Punch, was sentenced to a life of servitude. Essentially, he was the first slave on record, and that's the key word, on record, in the Virginia colony.
3 men on the same farm, doing the same labor, being harassed and oppressed on a comparable level, to the point that these 3 men chose to flee their owner.
John Punch, Victor, and James Gregory crossed the Virginia border into southern Maryland. Days later, they were captured and returned.
Plaintiff, please step forward. State please. My lord, I ask your punishment against these indentured servants.
In the colony's highest court, it was said that Hugh Gwynn's servants caused him considerable loss and prejudice.
I want you to punish them, my lord. You will serve 3 more years.
The 2 white men are sentenced to simply a number of years added to their indentures. For John Punch, the one black among these 3 men, his fate is infinitely worse, it's servitude for life.
For the rest of your life.
Now, there's no law that says that John Punch had to have been enslaved for life, but it was clear that 1640 is sort of the turning point, the beginning of the point where Africans are going to be treated differently as opposed to whites who are indentured servants.
Now, this is the first significant difference in the court system of America, and black people have been disproportionately affected ever since. And this was in 1640. Now, in 1641, the first and only person of African descent, Matthias de Souza, and he was probably mulatto, that's why they say of African descent. But he was the first and only one of African descent to be elected into Maryland's General Assembly in colonial times. Now, the Pilgrims didn't land at Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts until 1620. Now, of the Europeans who were already over here committing the crimes, the Pilgrims were the ones who were their criminals and so-called quote-unquote outcasts. And they said they were escaping religious persecution, but really they just let them out of jail and sent them over here. And then the Pilgrims are the ones who had the nerve to be pushing religion more than anybody. Now, by the time the Pilgrims got here, most of the native population in those areas had been wiped out due to diseases and wars. But the ones who were there, guess what they did? They still welcomed them in with open arms. When they were about to go through their starving times, they showed them how to cultivate the land, how to fish. And by the next year, their harvest was so abundant that they ate for 3 days. You know, and that's where the myth of Thanksgiving comes from. Now, I'm not going to go through the Mayflower Compact and all of that. You can take an English course or something. But when they got here, they said they were going to rule separate from the Virginia colony and establish their own thing. And their colony had more women and children than in Virginia. Now, even though they claim to be escaping religious persecution, these self-righteous Pilgrims were the first to officially legalize slavery in North America in Massachusetts in 1641. Now, by 1642, the Virginia colony made sure to pass a law to distinguish black women from all other women. And here you kind of see the war on the black family and on black women start to take place. And multiple statutes in Virginia require every youth 16 and up to pay taxes. But all women except for black women were exempt from paying taxes. And it was a lot of laws like these that made it difficult for black women even in that time to find partners. They passed another law in 1668 that said black women had to pay taxes. And so if you married a white girl or an Indian girl, but if you married a black woman, you would have to pay double the taxes. So it made it harder for black women to find partners. And 380 years later, we still see this war on black women and how it affects our communities to this day. Now, even though they made it hard, the first black marriage on record was in New Amsterdam in 1641. So even back then, black people still made sure to have black families. They didn't care. Now, in Virginia, the first fugitive slave law was passed in 1642. And it said anybody who helped a slave escape would be fined in a pound of tobacco. And the second time a black person tried to escape, they would be branded like they brand cows with the letter R. Now, not to be outdone, the Pilgrims in the North, the New England Confederation, and the Dutch and New Netherlands adopted their own fugitive slave laws. And Rhode Island was the only place that had some kind of regulation on slavery after they passed a law that said you couldn't keep a slave more than 10 years. But, of course, it was rarely enforced. Now, I know we covered a lot of things, but before we end this session, there's a couple important things that I do want to cover. Because this is where we start to see this American culture take shape. And we saw how deception was used with African leaders and how they felt if they accepted and converted to European ways, it would save them. And treaties and all of that stuff, how it didn't work. Well, it was the same thing in America. And it's important to see that, accepting the ways of the Englishmen, of the Portuguese, of the Spaniards, accepting the ways of the European, and adopting another religion as opposed to what you've been following hasn't necessarily helped or saved you. And with America, this little window of time where a lot of these talking points are born out of, it's important for us to really look at it before we end this session. Now, how many of you have heard people say, well, the first slave owner in America was black? And obviously, we know that's not true because we just saw the John Punch case in 1640. And, it would be that white planter or white slave owner, Hugh Gwynn, who is likely still alive and still enslaved during this time period. Now, when people say the first slave owner is black, they're talking about a brother named Anthony Johnson. And I do admit his story is an unusual story. And not only because he was in that little brief window of time where it was relatively equal, but even during that time, Anthony Johnson still received treatment that most other black people didn't get. When his house burned down, the court agreed to exempt him and his wife from paying taxes for life, despite the laws against black women paying taxes. And this happened at a time where most black people, even if they were free, they still weren't getting the land they were entitled to. Now, Anthony Johnson was a black plantation owner, and he had black workers and white workers. But in 1654, his neighbor, Robert Parker, convinced one of his servants, John Casser, that he could leave because his indenture was over. And the white dude, Robert Parker, eventually hired him himself. Now, when Anthony Johnson found out, he sued his neighbor, Robert Parker, and John Casser. And the court ordered the white dude to pay him dues and ordered John Casser to return. So although his indenture was over, he still had to work for Anthony Johnson, essentially making him what they classified as a slave. But this was 14 years after the John Punch case. And even though Anthony Johnson wasn't the only black land owner, he was likely seen as a black Englishman. Now, we often hear this line to justify hundreds of years of abuse, mistreatment, but Anthony Johnson wasn't the first slave owner in America, even though he may have been the first black one.
Anthony Johnson arrived in the Virginia colony in 1621 after being captured in his native Angola by an enemy tribe and sold to Arab slave traders. After 15 years of indentured servitude, Mr. Johnson and his wife Mary gained their freedom. By 1651, the Johnson family owned 250 acres of land and had 4 white indentured servants and 1 black. On March 8, 1655, a Northampton court ruled in favor of Anthony Johnson, who was accused of unlawfully keeping his black indentured servant as a slave. The landmark decision made Johnson one of the Virginia colony's first legal slave owners.
But what's unique about Anthony Johnson's story was that by the time he died, systematic racism was pretty much already in place. Anthony Johnson and his family was forced to move to Maryland because of slavery laws in Virginia. And by the time he died in 1670, an all-white jury ruled his land and property, including his servants, were to be seized by the state because he was a Negro and by consequence an alien. And, that means an illegal alien, not a citizen. But because he was a Negro, he was not entitled to the same rights. And the 50 acres of land he left his family ended up going to his neighbor, Robert Parker. It went to his son, George Parker, even though Anthony Johnson's son had been living on the land for years. So early on, when he was in this window, he may have gotten somewhere with this accepting the ways of the Englishmen and becoming a Christian. But by the time he died, it was already over. In the North, these righteous pilgrims in Massachusetts banned black people from arming themselves or training in the militia at all. So we already see them afraid and trying to take guns out of black people's hands because they already know. And every other colony in the North followed suit. But in 1661, Virginia started passing laws that laid the groundwork for chattel slavery that we know of today. And this certainly is a unique slavery that we have never seen in history, as we're going to see. But in 1661, they passed the first anti-miscegenation laws, or interracial marriage laws, and they banned Christians, basically white people, which they called Christians at the time, from having sex with Negroes, which was punishable by a fine. But in 1662, Virginia passed a hereditary law, which meant every child born to an enslaved woman inherited the status of the mother. So if your mom is a slave, then you are considered a slave, and to them perpetual means forever. So not only do black families have to pay more in taxes, it is a strong likelihood that your child and your future lineage will be born enslaved. Now, it's a reason why they went away, because, we're going by the doctrine of discovery in Christianity, and you are who your father is, and it's passed on through the father to the son. But they went away from all of that to see the first deviation from following their own laws of the doctrine of discovery. Because saying you are what your mother is still gave them sexual access to black women and allowed them to enslave their children, their own children. Now, if a black woman under an indentured contract had a child with her enslaver, whether it was consensual or not, she had to serve another 2 years on top of what she already had to serve, even if he raped her. Now, you already know they had to regulate the black man and white woman thing. And if a white woman was caught with a black man, then she was severely fined. And if she couldn't pay the fine, then she was forced into servitude. Now, we know Anthony Johnson had to leave Virginia and go to Maryland. But by 1663, Maryland said they presumed any black person coming into their colony was a slave. So if you were a black person in Maryland, they just considered you a slave. And if a white girl tried to marry a black man, then she lost her freedom too. Even though they left themselves access to continue to rape black women. But any child a white woman had with a black man in Maryland was automatically considered a slave. So basically, if either one of your parents were black in Maryland, you were automatically a slave. Now, down in South Carolina, or the areas we know as South Carolina today, they started giving slave owners 20 acres of land for every male slave they had and 10 acres of land for every female slave. Now, of course, all through this time, black people were continuously fighting back. And the first documented slave revolt in the colony happened in 1663. Now, the Glue Cluster Conspiracy, or the Birkenhead Rebellion, was the first time African slaves, European servants, and Native people united to fight. Now, they armed themselves and they planned to march to the governor's mansion to demand freedom. And if he refused, they were going to turn to violence or any means necessary. Now, before they got to the governor, a black servant, John Birkenhead, snitched on him. And as a reward, he did get his freedom and 5 pounds of tobacco, although I'm probably sure it did not help his descendants at all.
Check it out. Down here in Gloucester County, Virginia, man. This is where, like, one of the rebellions of Virginia, man. Like I said before, man, 84 rebellions took place down here in Virginia, man. I'm down here where the Gloucester conspiracy took place at, man. Where, you know, like 9 of our ancestors and some of their allies, man, was gonna rise up and take over the government of Gloucester County, man. The rebellion was spoiled by, you know, another person that wanted to be an informant and be a rat. So the rebellion didn't really take its full potential, but that's why I'm chilling at right now. Take a look around, man. Gloucester County. Salute to all the comrades and the ancestors, man, that was going to rebel that day, man. You know, power to the ancestors, man.
But there's one more thing I want to talk about before we end this session. And I know we've been over a lot of information and it may be a little bit long. But like I said, while we still in that little 20 to 30 year period, because from Africa to America, from then till now, and it's like we still haven't figured out accepting the ways of the Englishmen, adopting other people's cultures and traditions and religious practices, especially when they are counterintuitive to our own, has not helped us, has not got us out of any kind of treatment whatsoever. And this 20 to 30 year window 400 years ago still has an effect on us today, even though they shut that window real quick 400 years ago. In 1667, Virginia passed a law to ensure that baptizing Negroes wouldn't save them from bondage. And until then, they somewhat followed the doctrine of discovery in their own religion, but they clearly went against their own religion because you're not supposed to enslave another Christian for life. But they passed a law to ensure that getting baptized, becoming Christianized, changing your name, changing your religion, accepting the ways of the Englishmen or the Portuguese or the Spaniards or the Dutch will not save you from bondage. And slavery to them is forever. Perpetual means forever. Now, during this little 20 to 30 year window, one of the few people who actually did win their freedom through Christianity was Elizabeth Key Grinstead. Now, Elizabeth was a mulatto. Her father was Thomas Key, who was a member of the Virginia House of Burgess. And although he denied her, right, likely the product of raping his slave, and then enslaved his own daughter. But since he was a member of the House of Burgess, they convicted him on anti-miscegenation laws. Now, he was forced to take care of her, and after he baptized her, he arranged for her to get an apprenticeship so she can learn skills. Now, after Thomas Key died, she was sold to a white dude named John Mottram. And even though her indenture ended, he kept her enslaved for years. Now, one day he bought more indentured servants, and Elizabeth ended up marrying one of them, which was a white dude named William Grinstead. Now, this white dude was a lawyer, so after they had kids, he convinced her to file for her freedom and the freedom of their son. Now, Elizabeth argued that since she was a Christian and the daughter of a white man, it's against English law to enslave her. And eventually, she actually won the suit. And even though Elizabeth won her freedom by adopting to Christianity, it wasn't a widespread thing. Elizabeth also argued that her father was a white man and she was a mulatto. Her husband was a white dude who was a lawyer.
Elizabeth Key Grinstead was the first woman of African ancestry in North American colonies to sue for her freedom of slavery and win. Elizabeth was born 1630 and died 1665. Elizabeth Key won her freedom and that of her infant son, John Grinstead, on July 26, 1656 in the colony of Virginia. She sued based on the fact that her father was an Englishman and that she was a baptized Christian. Based on these two facts, her English attorney and common law husband, William Grinstead, argued successfully that she should be freed. The lawsuit in 1655 was one of the earliest freedom suits by a person of African ancestry in the English colonies. There is very little documented information on Elizabeth, so if you know any more information that I haven't stated, please comment below.
But very few fully black people were able to get this benefit. But many people adopted it and threw away their own religious practices and beliefs, hoping that it would save them. And it has not. Neither has accepting the ways of the Englishmen. Now, we're going to end the second session here, but it was important that we looked at this 20-year window. And it's important that we realize accepting other people's ways and traditions and religions won't necessarily save us. Because we saw how some African leaders and kings and tribes responded as opposed to how others reacted. We see how the English started to gain power and how they laid the groundwork for the chattel slavery that we know of today. And we can't forget the Pilgrims in the North. And I always make sure that I point out the Pilgrims and all of the horrible things that they did, even though they were supposedly escaping religious persecution. And even though they governed themselves differently, they still acted the same. But, in my opinion, that 10 to 20 to 30 year period still haunts us today because we still believe accepting the ways of the Englishmen and giving up our identity for others will save us or get us out of this treatment. But unfortunately, that has not worked. But now that we see chattel slavery starting to form, next week we're going to look at how it was enforced with things like the Casual Killing Act. We'll see the first John Brown and what that was really about. John Brown before John Brown. And hopefully we'll get to the creation of whiteness as an identity. But I appreciate everybody for joining me on this second session. I know we covered a lot tonight. If you got any questions, definitely let me know. Feel free to ask. And we'll pick it up again next week with our third session. So as always, man, we have got to start standing for something, or we're going to keep falling for anything.